The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machinery counting down to something nobody wanted to acknowledge. Sacred Heart ER thrummed with the controlled chaos of Tuesday afternoon, monitors beeping in staggered rhythm. The ventilator in Trauma Bay 3 wheezed its mechanical breath, and somewhere down the corridor a patient was screaming about the pain in their shoulder. Laura Bennett moved through it all like she was not there at all. 20 years dissolved into the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. 20 years of command, of carrying people out of Tikrit with shrapnel in her legs and a radio headset slick with someone else's blood, reduced now to a name badge that read simply RN and scrubs the color of surrender. The other nurses did not know. The doctors certainly did not know. The hospital administrator who had hired her 6 weeks ago based on her flawless credentials and 3 professional references had no idea that the quiet woman in the corner had once coordinated medical triage for 247 soldiers across 3 forward operating bases. She had chosen this invisibility the way a soldier chooses camouflage. She had chosen Sacred Heart in Denver because it was far enough from the coast, far enough from the places where someone might recognize the call sign she no longer answered to. The nightmares had gotten worse. Every helicopter sounded like incoming fire. Every trauma activation sent her back to Sanjin Valley at 03 for 7 hours with her hands full of wounds she could not close. She had walked away from her command without telling her sister where she was going, without filing the paperwork that would explain why Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett of Naval Hospital Balboa simply vanished. Some people disappear into the city. Some people disappear into nursing. The morning shift had been routine. 2 pneumothorax cases, 1 acute MI that resolved with medication, a teenager with a dislocated shoulder. Laura had worked the chest tube insertion on the first pneumothorax case with the kind of precision that made the assigned resident pause and watch. She did not explain herself. She never did. Her hands moved through the procedure with the muscle memory of 100 field operations: find the safe zone, 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, slide the catheter home, and when the lung re-expanded on the chest X-ray, the resident had nodded at her with something close to respect. She had already moved on to the next task. Acknowledgement was a luxury for people with something to hide. Laura had everything to hide. It was 14:38 hours when Drive Pierce Hargrove walked into Trauma Bay 1, and everything changed. The patient was a 73-year-old man named Robert Chen with a massive head bleed from a fall, and Hargrove had decided he needed to be intubated immediately. Laura watched from the corner where she was restocking the crash cart, her eyes moving between the monitor and Hargrove's hands. His technique was sloppy. His left hand was positioned wrong, his angle too steep, and the endotracheal tube was going to strike the epiglottis instead of sliding past it into the trachea. The sedation was going to wear off in 4 minutes. The patient was already desaturating. O2 sat at 88 and falling. She stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. Just sideways into the space beside Hargrove, her hands already moving, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. Reposition your left hand. Angle at 30 degrees, not 45. Hargrove's face went white with rage. He was not accustomed to being corrected, especially not by someone in scrubs who had not spoken a full sentence to him in 6 weeks. But his hands were shaking slightly, and the tube was genuinely in the wrong position, and Robert Chen's oxygen saturation was now 84 and dropping toward the kinds of numbers that meant permanent brain damage. Laura reached over and adjusted his grip. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. She tilted his wrist 3 degrees. She guided the tube with the kind of precision that came from having done this intense with artillery shaking the ground. The endotracheal tube slid home. The ventilator took over. O2 sat 91. 96. Stable. The room went dead silent. Hargrove stepped back from the ventilator like it had burned him. His jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscle working beneath his skin. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge that she had just saved that man from aspiration and permanent neurological damage. He just turned and walked out of the trauma bay, and everyone in the room watched him go, and nobody spoke, and the only sound was the ventilator wheeze and the steady beep of a heart monitor that was beating because Laura Bennett had corrected a surgeon's incompetence in front of 6 witnesses. That was the moment Dr. Hargrove decided to end her. By noon the next day, he was sitting in the hospital cafeteria surrounded by 3 board members, and he was making a bet. Laura heard about it from Martinez, one of the other nurses, who mentioned it while restocking the medication dispensary with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from not understanding you are stabbing someone who is listening. He says she is not going to last a week, Martinez had said, shaking her head. Said she is at a flight risk, whatever that means. Says she is too soft for emergency medicine. Laura had continued restocking the medications. Fentanyl patches. Morphine sulfate. Midazolam. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not break. What was the bet, she had asked. $200. He says you quit by Friday. That had been yesterday. Today was Thursday. The humiliation came at 1,147 hours in the cafeteria, in front of 37 people, during the lunch shift when the ER was staffed but not critical. Hargrove had timed it perfectly. Laura had gone to the cafeteria for the first time all week because her blood sugar was bottoming out and she needed 30 minutes to sit and not think about anything. She was standing in line holding her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water, nothing fancy, nothing that required attention, when Hargrove appeared beside her. He did not speak. He just smiled. And then he bumped her deliberately, his shoulder catching the edge of her tray, and her lunch scattered across the tile floor. Turkey sandwich sliding across the polished surface. Apple rolling beneath a chair. Charts that had somehow ended up on her tray, because of course they had, because he had set this up, spilling across the floor in a cascade of paper. The cafeteria got quiet the way cafeterias do when violence is about to happen. Not physical violence. Something worse. Pick that up, sweetheart, Hargrove said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. His smile was a wolf showing its teeth. A nurse should know how to clean up her own messes. Laura took one measured breath. She felt the air moving into her lungs, felt her body inventory itself for damage. This was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. It was not even in the top 100 things that had ever happened to her. In Tikrit, she had held a 19-year-old Marine with his left arm blown off below the elbow, and she had told him he was going to live, and he had, and 3 weeks later he had thanked her while crying. This was a man with a wounded ego and access to institutional power. This was a mosquito. She could live with mosquitoes. A single tear escaped. It rolled down her cheek without her permission, without her choice, and she let it. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and her voice when she spoke was so calm that everyone in the cafeteria had to lean in to hear it. I have cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor, she said. Some of them even survived. She knelt down and began gathering her things. Turkey sandwich. Apple. Charts. The silence in the cafeteria was so complete that she could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like something trying to get in. Hargrove stood above her for 3 seconds that felt like 30 seconds, and then he walked away, his face the color of spoiled meat. Laura stood up. Threw away her ruined lunch. Walk back to the ER. Got to work. But that was not the worst part. That was the setup. The real disaster was already walking toward her, unconscious and bleeding, and she had no idea yet that finding what he carried in his jacket lining would change everything. The ambulance arrived at 1,522 hours with a trauma alert. John Doe, 28 to 32 years old, found beaten down behind the Paramount Theater downtown, unresponsive, extensive facial trauma, possible rib fractures, BP 78/46 and dropping. They rolled him into Trauma Bay 2 while the paramedic was still talking, and Laura was already moving, already cutting away his clothes, already looking for the identifying information that would tell them who this man was and who to call. She found the wallet first. Empty except for $43 in cash and a library card from 6 years ago with an address in Seattle. Then she found the driver's license in his jacket pocket, expired from 2019, the picture too blurred with age to tell her anything useful. And then, while her hands were sliding along the interior seam of his jacket looking for anything else, insurance cards, emergency contact, next of kin, her fingers caught on something that made her hands freeze. Dog tags. Sewn directly into the jacket lining with military-grade stitching. Morrison, Jacob. 218-6477, a positive. She was still holding the tags when she noticed the belongings piled on the trauma bay counter. His shoes. Not the kind you could buy at a mall. Not the kind a civilian just had lying around. These were Tikrit deployment issue Army combat boots, worn at the heel where a soldier's weight settled during 8-hour patrols, the laces tied with the specific knot that the 75th Ranger Regiment trained into muscle memory. She knew those boots. She had worn those boots. She had walked through Sanjin Valley in those exact boots while holding a radio headset and calling in medevac coordinates for people who did not make it home. Her breath caught. Army Ranger. Same unit she had trained with at the Joint Base. Same uniform she had worn. Same war. The monitor beeped 3 times in quick succession. Jacob Morrison's blood pressure had dropped to 71/38. His O2 sat was 94 but falling. They did not have time for whatever this connection meant. They had maybe 6 minutes before his organ started shutting down from hypovolemic shock. Laura pushed everything else away, the dog tags, the boots, the sudden vertigo of recognition, and moved to his full line. This was what she was good at. This was what she had trained for. She could process the past later. Right now, a Ranger was bleeding out. She inserted a second large bore with the kind of efficiency that made the trauma resident step back and watch. 16 gauge, right antecubital fossa, first stick, blood flashback bright and immediate. She was already reaching for the first unit of O negative before anyone had to ask. Second line is in, she called out, her voice steady as concrete. Push fluids. Type and cross, full trauma workup. Get CT prepped. He is losing about 150 milliliters per minute. Nobody questioned her. They never questioned her on procedure, only on everything else. The resident was already calling to the lab. Hargrove was not in the trauma bay, he was somewhere else, licking his wounds, planning his next move, not knowing that this unconscious Ranger was about to turn his entire narrative upside down. Laura was setting up the massive transfusion protocol when Jacob Morrison's eyes flickered. They were only open for 2 seconds before the sedation pulled him back under, but in those 2 seconds, while she was running sutures through his arm to secure the 4, her hands moving with the specific knots of someone who had done this 1,000 times before in field hospitals under fire, he had stared directly at her face and his lips had moved. One word. Barely a whisper. A call sign she had not heard in 3 years. Phantom, he had said. And then he was gone again, unconscious, unaware that he had just recognized someone who did not exist anymore, someone who had chosen to stop existing, someone who had buried herself so deep in invisibility that even the past was supposed to forget her name. The monitor beeped steady. 47 beats per minute. Normal. Everything in the ICU looked normal except for the fact that Laura's hands were shaking and she had buried them in her lap where no one could see them. The Ranger had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known. She had secured his 4 with a modified field knot, a splice variation taught only at Pendleton, and only to field medics with certification 3 levels beyond standard nursing protocol. The kind of knot that held under fire, under chaos, under conditions where failure meant someone's blood pressure dropping into the basement. And his eyes had opened just long enough to whisper a single word that had erased 20 years of invisibility in 2 syllables, phantom. It wasn't a request. It was recognition. Laura stood from the bedside and moved through the ICU corridor with deliberate slowness, letting muscle memory be muscle memory without letting it show. Her pace was measured. Clinical. Just another nurse doing rounds. Dr. Hargrove was somewhere in the building at 3:27 a.m., and she had to assume he had heard nothing yet. The Ranger was in and out of consciousness. The ICU staff, Janet with her 17 years, Marcus with his degree still wet from graduation, Yuki with her daughter in middle school, they had all been focused on monitors and vitals. None of them would have caught the significance. None of them knew that particular knot meant anything beyond secure for technique. None of them had been at Tikrit. But Hargrove knew how to move through institutional politics like a predator through tall grass. He had spent his morning making calls. Laura would learn this later, but she felt it in the weight of the silence that followed the ranger's whisper, the way the universe seemed to pause before it exhaled. By 7:22 a.m., when the day shift arrived and the cafeteria filled with the smell of burnt coffee and stale croissants, Hargrove was already positioned at the central table with his lunch tray spread like a declaration of war. He had invited 3 residents to sit with him. Surgical attendings. People with voting power on the hospital credentialing committee. Laura watched from the nurse's station as Hargrove turned his head toward her with the kind of deliberate precision that made clear this was choreographed. Planned. A performance. Bennett, he called out. Loud enough that the entire cafeteria shifted its attention like a school of fish turning on a single impulse. I've made a wager with Dr. Chen and Dr. Morrison here. I'm betting you won't last another week. You're not cut out for Sacred Heart. Too much pressure. Too much hierarchy. You can't handle taking direction from a superior. He smiled. The smile had no warmth. It had only teeth. What do you think? Am I right? The room held its breath. 43 people. Laura counted them without looking. She had always counted exits, always counted bodies, always maintained situational awareness even when she was supposed to be invisible. 43 staff members waiting to see if the quiet nurse would shrivel under public scrutiny. Waiting for her to defend herself or cry or apologize for something she hadn't done. She didn't flinch. She took a measured breath and returned her attention to the charting she had been doing. The stylus in her hand remained steady. Steady as a surgical laser. Steady as someone who had held a field dressing in place while a helicopter rotor washed sand and debris across a landing zone outside Sanjin. Your opinion doesn't interest me, Doctor, she said without looking up. Her voice had dropped. It was quiet now. Flat. The kind of quiet that made people lean in to hear it, which meant they paid more attention. I'm here to do nursing. The rest is between you and administration. She could see Hargrove's face go red in her peripheral vision. The flash started at his collar and crawled up his neck like fire-consuming dry wood. He had expected tears. Apologies. The defensive posturing of someone backed into a corner. Instead, he had gotten indifference. And indifference, to a man who operated on the assumption that everyone would fear him, was a weapon that cut deeper than any response he had prepared for. His hands curled into fists against the cafeteria table. Several residents suddenly found their food very interesting. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. The silence had weight. But it wasn't finished. Hargrove never let anything finish if he could control it. The lunch line ran perpendicular to the charting station. Laura collected her tray at 11:38 a.m., a container of soup, a sandwich wrapped in paper the color of old teeth, an apple that had been in storage too long. She was walking back to the break room, keeping to the edges of the hallway as she always did, when she felt him position himself at her left shoulder. Hargrove. The smell of expensive cologne arrived before she saw him, a scent like a predator marking territory. He waited for her to pass by. She did. And then he moved. The bump looked accidental to anyone watching. A simple collision. A moment of carelessness between colleagues. But Laura felt the calculated force of it, the precision with which he had angled his body, the exact amount of pressure applied to send her tray airborne without creating obvious contact. Charts scattered across the linoleum. Plastic containers tumbled. The soup spilled in a spreading stain that looked like blood, and for a moment, for just a moment, Laura was not in a hospital hallway in Denver. She was on the tile outside a surgical tent in Tikrit, and the red spreading across white was not tomato soup but evidence of triage failure, and the weight pressing down on her chest was not humiliation but responsibility. Then the moment passed. She blinked. The soup was only soup. Hargrove's voice came from above her, loud enough to draw a semicircle of staff into the hallway. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Looks like you made a mess." He smiled down at her with the expression of a man who had just performed a magic trick. Who believed himself untouchable. Better clean it up before someone slips. 37 people watched. Laura could count the breathing. Could count the pulses in the fluorescent-lit silence. She could have responded with anger. Could have matched his energy with clinical precision, cutting him down with the kind of words that would have made him understand, truly understand, that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. She could have let the rage that lived in her shoulders, that spent every night pressing down on her sternum like a weight on a corpse, she could have let it speak. Instead, she took one measured breath. Straightened. Met his eyes with perfect clarity. And when she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had seen the absolute worst that the world could offer and had simply moved on. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor," she said. Not angry. Not defensive. Just stating fact. Some of them even survived. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. She watched the realization land on his face, not the insult itself, but what it meant. That he had not broken her. That she had not crumbled under the weight of his public humiliation. That there was something in her composure, something in the absolute lack of fear in her eyes, that suggested dimensions he had not anticipated. She wiped her eye with a single finger. No tears. Just a gesture. Just a reminder that she had registered the moment and chosen to let it pass. One tear fell, separate and singular. She caught it before it hit her cheek, wiped clean without breaking eye contact. Not crying. Choosing. There was a difference, and everyone in that hallway understood it in the way that people understand messages from other dimensions. Hargrove's face had shifted from rage to something else, something approaching genuine concern that perhaps he had misjudged what he was standing next to. His hand dropped. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Laura knelt and began collecting the scattered papers. Nobody moved to help. Nobody spoke. The hallway had become a place where normal physics no longer applied. By 1:13 p.m., the Ranger had regained consciousness again. Laura was securing a new the original had infiltrated, the saline pooling beneath the skin at his wrist, when his eyes opened. Not sedated this time. Aware. Tracking her hands with the precision of someone who had spent his career understanding the difference between competent and expert medical technique. His breathing was shallow but regular. O2 sat holding at 94%. Stable. As she inserted the angiocath into the radial artery with the kind of precision that came from having done this procedure 374 times in field conditions where failure meant watching someone die, he watched her hands with the focus of a sniper tracking a moving target. "Phantom," he said again. His voice was stronger this time. Certainty replacing confusion. From the battalion aid station. "Outside Tikrit. You were there." It wasn't a question. His eyes traveled from her hands to her face, searching for confirmation of something he already knew to be true. Year 8. When the supply line got ambushed and we had 14 casualties within 6 minutes. You were the one who, he stopped. Swallowed. The 4 was secure now. The saline running at 30 milliliters per hour. She was already moving away, already creating distance, already trying to be invisible again even though the word was out now. Out and floating through the ICU. You taught us that not. That modified splice. You said it would hold in any condition. That it was made for chaos. Laura continued walking. Her pace did not change. Her hands did not shake. Behind her, the Ranger's monitor continued its steady beeping, and she could feel the weight of his recognition like a physical thing, like something with mass and density. By 2:33 p.m., when she passed the nurse's station, she heard Janet speaking in low tones to Marcus, heard the phrase "the military background" float through the hallway like a ghost, heard the question forming in real time, who was this woman really? Hargrove would have heard it too. He would have understood immediately that his strategy had shifted. That public humiliation alone would not be sufficient. That he needed to move from social attacks to something more sophisticated, something that would require him to activate the network of influence he had spent 15 years building. Board members, credentialing officers, colleagues at other hospitals who owed him favors. The kind of institutional machinery that could dismantle someone's career with efficiency and precision. By 4:22 p.m., the first call had been made. The monitor screamed. Flat line. No rhythm. Just the electric void of a heart that had stopped beating at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday when the world was still pretending to be normal outside the ER windows. 2 hours. Morrison had been conscious for exactly 2 hours, his eyes tracking Laura's movements with the precision of someone trained to read rooms for threats. Then the internal bleeding from his spleen decided it had waited long enough. The abdominal pressure spiked. His breathing went shallow. Blood pooled where it had no business being. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen 3 feet from the bed, his hand reaching toward the phone on the wall like it was mounted in quicksand. His mouth moved but nothing came out. The trauma surgeon was in OR 2, 47 minutes away by elevator and operating room turnover time. The patient had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest became irreversible. Maybe less. Laura didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of time. She was already moving, her feet covering the distance to the crash cart in 3 steps that sounded like boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. The pericardiocentesis tray sat in the emergency supplies drawer where it always was, and her hands knew the path by muscle memory older than her civilian life. Sterile gloves. Betadine. A 14-gauge needle on a syringe. Field training from Tikrit Field hospitals where a medic either learned to drain blood pooling around the heart or watched patients die on gurneys that had seen worse wars than most people could imagine. The room went electric with panic. A resident started hyperventilating. The nursing assistant backed toward the door like the patient's chest had become contagious. Monitors shrieking in that particular frequency that meant everyone's career could end in the next 60 seconds. Nobody moved except Laura. She positioned herself at Morrison's left midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark between the 5th and 6th ribs burning into her spatial memory like coordinates on a map. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, her other hand stabilizing his chest with the kind of practiced firmness that came from holding men down while they screamed in dusty tents 8,000 miles away. Hargrove's voice broke. "We need a surgeon. I'm calling." The hiss of air escaping. That's what they teach you in the textbooks. But what they don't teach you is the sound of a man's chest relaxing, the subtle shift in pressure when fluid leaves the pericardial sac where it shouldn't be living. The needle found the pocket of accumulated blood, and Laura drew back on the syringe with the authority of someone who had done this before. 30 milliliters. Then 40. Blood dark as old wine pooling in the syringe chamber, each millimeter of withdrawal a small victory against the patient's deteriorating oxygen saturation. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Sinus rhythm. O2 sac climbing, the respiratory therapist whispered. 68. 72. 79. The voice climbed with the numbers, amazement replacing the earlier panic. 85. 88. 92. Stable. Laura withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used inserting it, applying pressure to the small wound with a sterile gauze pad. Hargrove stood by the phone, his hand still raised, his mouth still open, his face the color of the hospital walls, institutional beige drained of all authority. "We need to get him to OR," Hargrove said. The words came out small, squeezed through a throat that had forgotten how to command. "For the spleen. He'll need a splenectomy." "Already called," Laura said. She hadn't raised her voice. She never did. Senior chief petty officers don't need to shout. The ones who survive don't need to. Surgeons prepping now. ETA 8 minutes. The room was quiet in a way that made the fluorescent lights overhead sound like they were singing. Every person present had just watched Laura Bennett, the deferential RN who picked up her lunch tray without complaint, perform an emergency procedure that required her to access knowledge that shouldn't exist in a woman who had spent 20 years in a civilian hospital. A pericardiocentesis wasn't taught in standard nursing school curriculum. It was taught in advanced trauma medicine. It was taught in field hospitals. It was taught to people who wore uniforms. The resident stared at her hands. "How did you?" "Protocol," Laura interrupted, her voice still level, still soft, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen. "I did a rotation in trauma surgery. Years ago." The lie sat between them like a patient on a gurney, breathing its own shallow breaths. Hargrove's face was changing now. The shock was burning away, revealing something underneath it that looked like rage, but wasn't quite. It was humiliation. It was the sound of a man whose authority had just been exposed as borrowed, rented, a costume that fit until someone pulled it off in front of 37 people in an emergency room. Morrison's eyes were open now, his breathing less labored, and he was looking directly at Laura with the kind of recognition that transcends consciousness. His lips moved, trying to form words. Laura leaned in, her ear close enough to hear him over the monitors and the overhead paging system. "Phantom." The word came out barely above a whisper, but it landed like a grenade. "You were Phantom." The room didn't go silent because it already was. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of people realizing they had just witnessed something that didn't have a simple explanation. A name that wasn't hers. A call sign. The kind of thing that only existed in classified files and unit histories that were never discussed outside the wire. Laura straightened, her expression unchanged, though something in her posture shifted. The deferential nurse had moved an inch closer to something else entirely. "Let's get you stabilized for surgery," she said to Morrison. "And nobody talks about what they saw in the next 10 minutes. That's not protocol. That's survival." The surgical team was already moving. The operating room was already warming. And Dr. Hargrove was standing by the phone with his hand slowly lowering, his face processing information that his brain didn't have clearance to understand. What happened in the next 4 hours would define careers. But what he didn't know yet was that the next 4 hours were nothing. The real consequences were still waiting, 37 miles away in a Pentagon office where a soldier's name had just appeared on someone's radar. Within an hour of the successful procedure, Hargrove's hands were already on his phone. The cardiac tamponade was resolved. Morrison's vitals had stabilized. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. But for Hargrove, the medical outcome meant nothing compared to what had just been exposed, his own paralysis, his own inadequacy, broadcast live in front of 32 people wearing the same scrubs he did. He stood in his office on the 4th floor, door locked, and made 3 calls. The first went to board member Patricia Chen, who owed him a favor from a malpractice settlement he'd quietly helped bury 2 years ago. The second went to Vincent Sterling, the hospital administrator whose daughter Hargrove's brother had hired as an intern. The third went to someone he'd never met but whose number he'd obtained from a colleague, a hospital credentialing investigator who worked freelance for institutions looking to quietly eliminate problems. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. His tone stayed measured, professional, the voice of a concerned physician protecting patient safety. He mentioned unauthorized procedures. He mentioned falsified credentials. He mentioned that a nurse without proper documentation had performed a surgical intervention beyond her scope of practice. He mentioned that the hospital's liability exposure could be catastrophic if this wasn't addressed immediately and quietly. He mentioned that he had witnesses. Documentation could follow. By 9:19 p.m., an email had arrived in Sacred Heart's compliance department flagging Laura Bennett for immediate credential review. Laura didn't see that email. She was in the staff locker room, still in her scrubs, removing her badge. The weight of the day pressed against her shoulders like a physical thing, dense and suffocating. Her hands moved automatically, turning the combination dial on her locker, pulling the metal door open to the small space she'd claimed as hers. 20 years in the Navy had taught her to keep possessions minimal. One change of clothes. A cracked coffee mug from a base exchange in Kandahar. A photo in a plastic frame. That was the extent of what lived in this locker. That was the extent of what Laura Bennett the nurse possessed. She reached for the mug first, wrapped it in her scrub jacket to protect it from the cardboard box she'd already gathered from the supply closet. Then she lifted the photo. 37 faces arranged in 4 rows. Platoon 2-1 from Forward Operating Base Shank, Logar Province, Afghanistan. May 2014. She looked at the faces now and counted the ones still missing. 7. That was 7 since the photo had been taken. Her finger traced the edge of the frame, not quite touching the glass. She knew every name. She knew what happened to each one. She knew the sound of the medevac rotors, the smell of the dust, the weight of the 4-bag as she'd held it above a Marine whose femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel. She didn't cry then. She wouldn't cry now. But her throat tightened like someone had tied a knot around her windpipe. The knock on her locker door came at 10:13 p.m. Laura didn't need to turn around to know it was Hargrove. She could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive and sharp, like chemical confidence. She continued packing the photo into the box without acknowledging him. He cleared his throat. The sound of a man preparing to deliver a verdict. "Dr. Chen called me," he said. His voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "There's an investigation opening. Credential review. They're calling your nursing school references first thing in the morning. Falsified documentation. Scope of practice violations." Laura turned slowly to face him. She held his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "You called them," she said. "Not a question. A statement of fact." His face flushed. "I reported a patient safety concern to the appropriate board members. As is my responsibility." She closed her locker with a soft click. The sound was louder than it should have been in the silence. "You were terrified," Laura said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. A patient coded. You froze. And someone else had to save him because you couldn't. So now you're burning down the person who made you look small. Hargrove's jaw tightened. You performed a procedure you're not qualified for. The hospital's legal team is all ready. It wasn't a request, Laura interrupted. She picked up the cardboard box. The mug shifted inside. "I'm resigning, effective now. You won't have to fire me." She moved past him toward the door. He stepped sideways to block her path. The movement was small, deliberate, meant to establish dominance in the confined space. His presence felt like pressure in the air. Laura looked at him. One measured breath. She'd stared down insurgents in alleyways. She'd held the hand of a young ranger while a surgeon worked to save his legs. This man's rage was nothing. It was the tantrum of someone who'd built his entire life on hierarchy and had just discovered he wasn't as high as he thought. "Move," she said. 3 letters. A statement that contained 20 years of certainty. Hargrove moved. She walked past him into the hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous song. Her footsteps echoed on the tile, each one a goodbye to something she'd tried so hard to forget she needed. By morning, the investigation had officially opened. An outside investigator named Marcus Feldman arrived at Sacred Heart with a folder thick enough to end a career. The folder contained her nursing school transcripts, her employment records, her references contacted by phone with specific questions about her credentials. When you dig into someone's past, you find inconsistencies if you look hard enough. A gap in her application where she'd listed military service but provided no dates. A reference from a commanding officer named Martinez whose phone number was disconnected. A nursing school graduation date that technically predated her nursing license application by 6 months, a paperwork error that had been corrected decades ago but lived in the system like a scar. None of it meant anything. All of it could be used. Feldman was efficient about it. He sat across from Laura in an empty conference room at 6:38 a.m., before the hospital truly woke, and laid out his findings like evidence in a crime. "Your transcripts show significant gaps," he said. "Your references are difficult to verify. Your military service is listed but can't be confirmed through VA records. And you performed a procedure yesterday evening that appears to be outside your documented scope of practice." Laura listened without speaking. She'd been trained to absorb information during interrogations. That was before. This was now. This was the cost of trying to disappear. "I performed an emergency pericardiocentesis," she said, "on a patient in cardiac tamponade. The procedure was indicated, the patient survived, and I documented everything." Feldman made a note. "The hospital's legal team has concerns about liability. We'll need to see your training documentation." There was no training documentation. There was only 20 years of field experience, classified missions, and hands that knew how to save lives in ways that didn't fit neatly into civilian nursing credentials. "I understand," Laura said. She stood up. The chair scraped against the tile with a sound like something breaking. "I'm done. I quit. As of now." She walked out of the conference room before he could respond. By 7:22 a.m., her resignation had been processed. By noon, word had spread through Sacred Heart that the nurse who'd challenged Dr. Hargrove had been let go for credential fraud. By evening, Laura stood at a bus stop on Colfax Avenue in the rain. The rain fell in sheets. Cold. Relentless. The kind of Denver rain that came in autumn, carrying the weight of a dying season. Laura sat on a metal bench, the cardboard box on her lap. The mug had cracked further during the packing. The succulent, a small echeveria she'd bought 6 months ago to prove she could keep something alive, was mostly brown now, the leaves curled in on themselves like hands giving up. The photo was still wrapped in her scrub jacket, protected from the wet. She was not. Water ran down her face, mixing with the tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in front of anyone. No one was watching now. This was the lowest point. The place where reinvention ended and reality began. She'd left the Navy to escape the nightmares. The helicopters that sounded like incoming fire. The weight of command. The faces in the photo she couldn't save. She'd thought civilian work would be different. She'd thought a quiet job in a hospital far from her past would let her breathe. She'd been wrong. Hargrove had found her anyway. The hierarchy she'd rejected had rejected her right back. She turned the dog tags over in her fingers. Morrison, Jacob. She'd saved him. She'd held his life in her hands and pulled it back from the edge. And it had cost her the only refuge she'd found. Maybe Hargrove was right. Maybe she wasn't qualified to be here. Maybe everyone would be better off if she just disappeared completely. She pulled the dog tags out fully now. The weight of them in her palm was real. The engraving was sharp against her skin. These belonged to someone else. These weren't hers to carry. She raised her hand, ready to drop them into the storm drain beside the bench. The metal felt cold. The darkness of the drain below looked absolute. And then she heard it. The sound started low. A distant thumping. A rhythm that her body recognized before her mind did. The mechanical heartbeat of a helicopter. Distant. Coming closer. Not yet overhead, but the direction was clear. North to south. The rotor wash getting heavier in the air. Laura's hand stopped. The dog tag sat balanced between her palm and the rain. She didn't move. She just listened as the sound grew louder, as the pressure in the air changed, as the rain itself seemed to pause in anticipation. Something was coming. Something was already coming. The two black SUVs pulled into Sacred Heart's parking lot at 6:11 a.m., tires rolling across wet asphalt still glazed from the pre-dawn rain. Laura sat in her Subaru 3 rows back, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might float away. Her cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, cracked coffee mug nestled against a dying succulent, the photograph of her Tikrit platoon folded face down beneath. The dog tags were still in her scrub pocket, metal warm against her ribs from body heat alone. She had not slept. Had not moved in 4 hours. The Pentagon officials wore identical grey suits and the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. They walked straight past the main entrance and headed toward the parking lot. Laura's breath stopped. Her hands knew before her mind caught up, muscle memory screaming warnings, the same instinct that had kept her alive in Helmand Province, in Fallujah, in every medevac that had ever screamed her name across the radio. One official scanned the lot. Locked eyes with her through the windshield. Laura did not run. They approached her car with the unhurried purpose of men who had learned that desperation was a tactical liability. The one on the left, dark hair, Bronze Star pin barely visible on his lapel, knocked on her window with 2 measured taps. She rolled it down without turning her head. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett. His voice carried the weight of 3-way radios and command authority. Not a question. Just Laura now, she said. Measured. Flat. The voice of someone who had already accepted the weight. Army Ranger Jacob Morrison regained full consciousness at 4:13 a.m. He identified himself to the attending physician. When they showed him the incident report with your photograph, he said one word. The official paused. Let the silence do its work. Phantom. The air in the car crystallized. That was your call sign in the field hospitals outside Tikrit, wasn't it, Senior Chief? The medic who moved like a ghost through triage, patching soldiers who had no business surviving, sending them back to units with heartbeats and blood pressure. Laura's grip on the wheel loosened. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years. Had not let anyone say it. Had buried Phantom in scrubs and humility and the deliberate erasure of everything she had once been. We need you inside, the second official said. His voice was softer. The ranger needs to thank you. But more importantly, your hospital needs you. She stepped out of the car. The cold Denver morning hit her face like a slap. Her hands were steady. They always were. The ICU waiting room was crowded. Parents. Visitors. Staff members who had been texted, called, pulled from morning routines by rumors moving faster than light. A security guard stood outside Morrison's room, and behind her, a small figure in a school uniform, Morrison's 10-year-old daughter, dark hair braided back, eyes that carried the particular gravity of children who had learned to fear phone calls at night. The girl stepped forward before anyone could speak. My dad says you're a senior chief petty officer. Her voice was high and clear and absolutely certain. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the precision of a child who had heard the words and understood their weight even if she did not know why. He says you saved his life twice. Once in Tikrit. Once last night. The waiting room went very still. A man in navy dress whites entered from the corridor, SEAL liaison, the rank boards on his shoulders catching the fluorescent light. His hands were trembling as he opened a manila folder. Laura could see the classification stamps from 10 feet away, the red boxes and blocked-out portions covering half of every page. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Special Operations Combat Medic, 160th SOAR Task Force, Tikrit Forward Operating Base, 2009 through 2012. He swallowed. Bronze Star Favela Under Fire, 2010. The room absorbed the words. Bronze Star, 2011. Silver Star for Actions in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2012. He looked up. Met her eyes. Continued. Navy Cross. 3 words. The weight of them seemed to break something in the room's atmosphere. Citation reads, for extraordinary heroism in action on October 14, 2012, when Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett, operating under heavy enemy fire near Forward Operating Base Shank, Loga Province, maintained security while coordinating the medical evacuation of 12 critically wounded soldiers, preventing secondary casualties through precise field triage and returning fire while administering combat aid under conditions of extreme danger. She maintained her position for 73 minutes until the last casualty was airlifted to safety. 73 minutes. 12 lives. One woman who had learned to move like smoke through the chaos of war. Laura's chest had locked tight. She was not breathing. The liaison set down the folder. "Your hospital destroyed you because you saved one ranger's life," he said quietly. "You are about to see something happen that rarely occurs in civilian institutions." The doors to the waiting room opened. A two-star general entered in dress blues, ribbon stacked like battle histories across his chest. The room shifted. People who had been sitting stood. The general's eyes found Laura, nodded once, then turned to where Dr. Hargrove had just appeared at the far end of the hallway, pale and backing toward the elevators. The general's voice carried across the waiting room like a command that had crossed continents. "Dr. Hargrove. This hospital employed a decorated war hero. A senior chief petty officer who had saved the lives of soldiers under fire. And you drove her out because your ego could not tolerate competence." His voice did not raise. It did not need to. "Your board should be ashamed. Your colleagues should be ashamed. But most of all, you should be ashamed." He walked toward Hargrove with the steady pace of a man who had spent decades delivering verdicts. "You are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from this building. The State Medical Board will receive notice of your termination within the hour. The State Attorney General has been briefed on your conduct. Expect contact." Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like something that had already been dead for weeks but had only just been told. The local news cameras, 2 of them, their operators scrambling to get angles, captured every second. His career draining away in real time, witnessed by the entire hospital staff and broadcast across Denver before sunrise. "You are relieved of all duties," the general continued. "Step away from Dr. Bennett. Step away from this patient. Step away from this hospital. And understand that your name will never be spoken in medical circles again without the context of this moment." Hargrove turned and walked toward the elevator. He did not run. He did not defend himself. He simply ceased to be a thing of consequence, fading like something that had never been real. Laura stood in the center of the waiting room while nurses she had worked with for 2 years looked at her with an understanding that seemed to arrive all at once, the invisible competent woman they had dismissed, the nurse who was somehow more. The little girl who had spoken her rank was crying now, not from sadness but from the strange relief of a child who suddenly understood that her father was going to be okay. 6 months later, Laura Bennett stood in her new office at the Denver VA Medical Center, rain drumming against the windows like applause. Dress whites hung on her frame like something she had finally earned the right to wear again. The combat boots, Morrison's boots, the one she had found tucked in his belongings that first night, sat on the shelf behind her desk. Ticrit issue. Desert tan leather worn soft by sand and survival. A reminder that some things you carry forever, and some battles choose you even when you're trying to hide. She had been offered Chief of Trauma. Director of Surgical Operations. She had accepted neither. Instead, she had taken the position of Senior Trauma Medic, which meant she still worked the ER floor, still checked vitals at 2:22 a.m., still moved through the corridors of the VA in scrubs rather than administrative office wear. The rank on her uniform now matched the experience beneath it. Morrison's daughter had visited last month, bringing a drawing, soldiers with wings, helicopter rotors spinning, a figure in the center marked simply, Phantom. It hung on her office wall. There was a knock. Morrison himself, still moving carefully but solid, wheeled into the room. Behind him, a woman in a Navy lieutenant commander's uniform, her presence electric with that particular gravity that surrounded the leadership. "Senior Chief," the commander said. "We were hoping you'd attend the Joint Task Force briefing next month. Tikrit Reconstruction. Veterans Integration Program. Your name keeps coming up." Laura looked at the combat boots. Looked at Morrison, who had learned to smile again. Looked back at the commander. "I'm here," she said quietly. "That's enough." The commander smiled, recognizing something in the statement that went deeper than words. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and the quiet certainty that they chose exactly where they needed to be. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this: would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.